Last time, we took you on a minute-by-minute look at the last day of the 51-day standoff at Waco, Texas, between Mount Carmel and the U.S. government. In this episode, we will focus on the aftermath of the Waco siege, what happened after the fire, and how its legacy shaped law enforcement, American culture, and extremism. I'm Rick Welch, and this is Prophet of Fire. It was the deadliest day in U.S. law enforcement history since 9/11, before 9/11 ever happened. On April 19, 1993, 76 people died in a blaze that consumed Mount Carmel, among them children, mothers, young men, and the man who had led them all, David Koresh. The world watched it live, the flames, the collapse, the horror. But what followed was a storm of silence, suspicion, and blame. In the hours after the fire, federal agents, fire marshals, and FBI forensic teams moved into the scorched remains of the compound. They expected bodies, but they weren't prepared for what they would find. The structure had collapsed inward. The central chapel, where many had taken shelter, was nothing but charred timber and metal. The stench of burned human flesh was overwhelming. Rescue workers had to use sifting screens to find remains. They recovered 76 bodies. 25 were children. Some were found in closets, others in concrete bunkers. A number of adults were discovered clutching the bodies of children. It was worse than anyone had imagined. Among the dead, David Koresh, found in a rear room with a gunshot wound to the forehead. Beside him, Steve Schneider, his second in command, also shot. Theories emerged fast. Did Schneider kill Koresh, then himself? Did Koresh end it all in an act of prophetic finality? Or did someone else, perhaps at Koresh's command, carry out a final act of cleansing? The answers burned with the compound. Autopsies offered grim detail. Many of the children had died from smoke inhalation, but a few had blunt force trauma to the skull, possibly from falling debris, possibly not. At least 20 adults had been shot, some in the head, execution style. Others had fatal wounds to the chest or back. Then there was the fire itself. Did the FBI start it? The Bureau insisted no incendiary devices were used. No agents fired a single round that day. But footage of tanks punching holes in the building and fire erupting moments later told a more complicated story. Survivors like David Thibodeau believe the fire began inside, but not because they wanted to die, because they had been driven to the edge. He recalls, quote, "They kept telling us to come out, but it wasn't that simple. People weren't thinking rationally anymore. They thought dying meant salvation." End quote. Meanwhile, the public was in shock. TV anchors spoke in stunned tones. Opinion columns called it a massacre. Some praised the FBI for ending a dangerous cult. Others compared it to Kent State, My Lai, and Jonestown. Protests erupted in Waco. The ATF office in Houston received bomb threats. Conspiracy theorists, many from emerging militia movements, began to speak one name over and over: Waco. It was no longer just a place. It was a symbol of mistrust, of extremism, of state power and perceived persecution. And the federal government would now be forced to explain how a search warrant turned into a funeral pyre. In the days following the fire, public scrutiny turned from the ruins in Waco to the government offices in Washington, D.C. Someone had to answer for what happened, and the person who stepped forward was the highest law enforcement official in the United States. On April 22nd, just 3 days after the fire, Attorney General Janet Reno stood before a press corps and took responsibility. Quote, "This was my decision. I made it. I am accountable for it." End quote. Reno explained that the FBI had assured her that children were being abused inside, that negotiations had stalled, that tear gas, not firepower, would be used. But as reporters pressed her on why the operation had to happen on April 19th, Reno admitted something few expected. Quote, "I was concerned about the welfare of the children." End quote. The public was torn. Some saw a decisive leader, others saw a scapegoat, or worse, an enabler. Inside the FBI, the internal after-action reports praised their tactical execution, but admitted key failures. They had misjudged Koresh's theology, they had underestimated the psychological power he had over his followers, and perhaps most damning, they had lost patience. The decision to initiate the final operation wasn't based on imminent danger, but on fatigue. As pressure mounted, the U.S. Congress launched a formal investigation. In July of 1995, more than 2 years after the fire, House and Senate committees held joint hearings on what became known as the tragedy at Waco. The hearings were emotional. Survivors like Kiri Jewell, just 14 years old, testified about being abused by Koresh. Quote, "He said it was God's will that I be his bride. I didn't want to, but I was taught not to say no." End quote. Others defended Koresh. Clive Doyle, one of the few adult survivors, said the government had no right to decide what was a legitimate religion. Quote, "We weren't crazy, we believed, and we didn't shoot first." End quote. Lawmakers grilled FBI officials over conflicting reports. Did agents fire shots? Did they use flammable devices? Did they ignore chances to de-escalate? And one of the most debated pieces of evidence? The use of pyrotechnic tear gas rounds. Initially, the FBI denied they were used, but years later, it was revealed that at least 2 such devices had been fired near a bunker at the rear of the compound, hours before the fire. But the final official word came in 2000 with the Danforth Report, an independent investigation led by former Senator John Danforth. His conclusion? The FBI did not start the fire. Agents did not fire weapons on April 19th. The fire was deliberately set from within, but the FBI did make tactical and strategic errors that contributed to the loss of life. Danforth called the siege a tragedy, not a conspiracy, not an assassination, but a failure of understanding, of patience, and of imagination. But outside the official reports, a different narrative was already spreading, and it was far from over. 9 adults escaped the fire. They emerged from the smoke broken, half-blind, and breathless. The media called them survivors. The government called them defendants. In the months that followed, 12 Branch Davidians were indicted on federal charges, including voluntary manslaughter, weapons violations, and conspiracy to murder federal agents. Their trial began in San Antonio in January 1994. It would stretch for nearly 2 months. The prosecution argued that these men and women helped orchestrate the firefight on February 28th, that they were willing soldiers in a battle against the United States. The defense said they were believers, brainwashed, terrified, and clinging to survival. Among the most high-profile defendants were Ruth Riddle, who helped smuggle out Koresh's handwritten seals manuscript, Livingston Fagan, a theology student from Britain, Brad Branch, accused of returning fire during the initial raid, Paul Fata, the group's arms dealer and alleged logistical planner. The verdicts were complicated. 8 were convicted, mostly on weapons-related charges. 4 were acquitted entirely. No one was convicted of murder. The judge, Walter Smith Jr., stunned observers by adding decades to the sentences of several men, using a rarely invoked provision that allowed him to enhance penalties if he believed the crimes involved intent to kill. The result? Some were sentenced to 40 years. Others received 20 or more. But over time, those sentences began to erode. In 2000, a federal appeals court reduced many of them. Some were released as early as 2006. Others remain incarcerated into the 2010s. Today, most of the surviving Davidians live quiet lives. Clive Doyle returned to Waco and remained a vocal defender of Koresh's teaching until his death in 2022. David Thibodeau, one of the few Inner Circle members to escape the fire, wrote a memoir and now speaks regularly about cult dynamics and the danger of extremist theology. Others vanished into silence, changed by trauma, grief, and belief. David Thibodeau recalls, quote, "I lost friends, I lost faith, I lost a piece of myself in that fire, but I didn't lose the truth of what happened." End quote. Some survivors still believe Koresh was the Lamb. Others now see him as a manipulator, a man who used scripture as a weapon and brought them to the brink of destruction. But whether loyal or lost, they all carry the same scars. The legal chapter may have closed, but Waco wasn't finished echoing through the American story, because even as courtrooms went quiet, something else was brewing. As the dust settled on Mount Carmel, a new narrative emerged, not from Washington, not from Waco, but from the American fringe. Waco became more than a tragedy. It became a spark. Within months of the siege, right-wing militias began citing Waco as proof that the federal government was out of control. Talk radio lit up with outrage. Conspiracy theories flourished in gun shows and survivalist newsletters. The ATF and FBI were labeled tyrants. Koresh was seen not as a cult leader, but as a martyr. One man in particular was listening closely. Timothy McVeigh was 25 years old when the Waco fire burned. A Gulf War veteran, disillusioned and angry, he visited the Mount Carmel ruins after the siege, taking photographs, speaking with survivors, and selling anti-government bumper stickers from the back of his car. He would later say Waco was his turning point. Exactly 2 years later, April 19th, 1995, McVeigh parked a Ryder truck outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. Inside the truck, over 4,800 pounds of homemade explosives. At 9:02 a.m., the bomb detonated. 168 people were killed, 19 were children. It was the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in American history. McVeigh later told reporters he chose the date intentionally, as revenge for Waco and Ruby Ridge. In his mind, he wasn't killing civilians, he was fighting tyranny. Quote, Waco was first, Oklahoma was the counterattack, end quote. Waco's influence didn't end there. It echoed through the Patriot movement, sovereign citizen circles, and anti-government militias. By the 2000s, it was a fixture in fringe culture, a cautionary tale twisted into ideology. In 2014, Cliven Bundy, a Nevada rancher engaged in a standoff with the Bureau of Land Management, invoked Waco by name. In 2021, rioters stormed the U.S. Capitol chanting about revolution. Some carried flags and patches referencing Waco. And today, in online forums and extremist manifestos, the name Waco still appears. Coded language for resistance, rebellion, and revenge. But the people who lived through it, who buried their families, who escaped the flames, tell a very different story. Not one of glory, but of grief. Survivor David Thibodeau recalls, quote, if you think Waco was about fighting back, you weren't there. You didn't see the kids. You didn't smell the smoke, end quote. Waco became mythologized by people who never set foot on its soil. But beneath the legend are the ruins of a real place, a real people, and a real warning. A warning about power, about belief, and about what happens when fear is louder than truth. Waco wasn't just a standoff. It wasn't just a fire. It was a fracture in the American psyche. A place where law, religion, media, and power collided, and no one walked away unscathed. Not the government, not the survivors, not the country. For some, Waco is a wound. For others, a warning. And for a few, it's still a calling. But for everyone, it remains a reminder of what happens when belief becomes blind, when prophecy becomes policy, and when nobody is willing to listen until it's too late. In our next episode, we close our series with what I call the Gospel according to Koresh. We'll go deeper into the teachings that shaped a prophet, how David Koresh built his theology from the book of Revelation, why people believed him, and whether there's anything we missed, something hidden in the seals, in the scriptures, or in ourselves. It's the story behind the story and the spiritual storm that still hasn't passed. I'm Rick Welch, and this is Prophet of Fire.